Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 15 lecture. So now let's talk about our final assigned reading of the semester, which is Circumstance by Harriet Prescott Spofford. So like I said, this comes from the larger collection called The Amber Gods. I wish we had time to read some more stories from this collection, but we really don't. At this point of the semester, I know we need to really get moving on those final assignments. So I wanted to keep the reading load for this final week of class very light. So Circumstance won't take up too much of your time. It's not terribly long. But Spofford is an interesting figure. I like to end with her because she's an interesting figure in her own right, but we can also compare her to some of the American Renaissance figures that we studied recently. But of course, we are in Unit 4 now, our final unit, and it's a pretty short unit. It really just consists of Blake and Circumstance. So hopefully you guys are finished with Blake by now, or at least you are finishing up early this week. And then you can turn to Circumstance, get it finished by the end of the week, and then that's it for us as far as assigned reading. And I don't have a discussion post made for this week, so that's kind of a shame. We're not going to have a chance to talk about Circumstance as a class, but this text will appear on the final exam. I mean, I'm probably going to ask some kind of a question about it. And you'll have an opportunity to write about Circumstance both on the final exam, and if you choose it, it could be your chosen text for the final paper. But Spofford is sometimes compared with Melville, Hawthorne, and some of these other figures that we studied from the American Renaissance back in Unit 3. So she's, kind of going to remind us of some stuff that we've read before, but she also might strike us as pretty modern and pretty forward-looking. A lot of people are struck by how scary Circumstance is. It is a very spooky, sort of atmospheric tale. Spofford really does show a lot of aptitude not only for creating a very vivid, memorable scene, but also just her style has attracted a lot of critical attention in more recent years. But her story is similar to a lot of the Renaissance figures that we've talked about, in the sense that Spofford kind of got rediscovered. She was popular back in the 19th century, but she eventually kind of fell out of favor. Some people speculate it's because her career was so long. She wrote for a really long time. So she was popular in the 1860s, the 1870s, into the 1880s, but she sort of faded from public consciousness by the end of the 19th century. And then through sort of the early to mid 20th century, she really wasn't read very much. So again, we've perhaps noticed a little bit of a trend, right? A lot of these women writers who were very popular in their day, and really throughout the 19th century, we've even seen examples going back to the 1790s. There were a lot of these popular women writers. Many of them were cranking out sentimental novels. Spofford sort of worked within that genre a little bit, but she also worked in other genres. But we've seen how a lot of these women writers were left out of the formation of the American literary canon, right? When that whole process was going on in like the 40s and 50s, we talked about F.O. Matheson and these American literature scholars who helped to sort of standardize the discipline. They largely focused on those Renaissance figures: Melville, Hawthorne, Poe, Whitman. They were really big fans of Emerson, many of them. So they mostly focused on these male writers from a pretty condensed time period, many of whom were not as popular in their own time as a lot of these female authors. But again, they largely dismissed sentimental literature as being artistically inferior. And now, in more recent times, we've begun to really interrogate that and sort of question that idea. And we've started to, study sentimental literature more. We've begun to study more women writers. And again, not all women writers were necessarily working within that genre, but that was often the conception or the assumption. And a lot of their work was often dismissed. So in the case of Spofford, she was sort of boosted or sort of rediscovered by a pretty important American lit scholar. He's still alive today, named Alfred Bendixson. And actually, I know we don't have this edition. I didn't order anything for Circumstance, but if you look at this edition that I have, this is the Amber Gods. This is the edition put out by Bendixson pretty recently. So this is kind of the really definitive scholarly edition of this short story collection. And Bendixson has done a lot to sort of bring Spofford back into the consciousness of a lot of academics, a lot of students. So she's increasingly getting taught and studied more, not just because of Bendixson, but he sort of started this back in the 1980s when he began to write about Spofford and her work. So yeah, he sort of brought her back, and a similar process played out with Melville and some of those other Renaissance figures who had kind of fallen into obscurity. Like we said with Melville and Poe, they were sort of discovered by Europeans. The French really liked Poe, and a lot of English writers and journalists had really gotten into Melville and Whitman even before those guys had really taken off in America. Again, none of them had been hugely popular during their lifetimes. They all became more popular posthumously. And in some ways, something like that has happened with Spofford as well. So one interesting thing to keep in mind, and again, we're not reading very much of her work, but it's just something to know about her. Part of the reason why she's an important figure is she kind of straddles these two very important genres. And really, she writes in more than just two, but she's often talked about as a writer of romance, and that's a blast from the past. That's a term that we've talked about before. Again, not talking about romance like rom-coms, talking about this older sense of romance that's really kind of existed since like medieval times, right? Back when romance would be contrasted with realistic fiction, right? Romance would feature extravagant settings, improbable events, sometimes supernatural events, and that would be, of course, different from stuff that was meant to be sort of realistic or sort of mirroring reality. So we talked about this with the early days of novels, how there was still this distinction being made between realistic novels that were often sort of ripped from the headlines and very much based on real events, like The Coquette, versus what would have been classified as romance. So Hawthorne talked about this. Hawthorne considered himself, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about him, but he considered himself to be a romancer, a writer of romances, because he had some improbable plot events and some hints of supernatural stuff, some exotic settings. So he, again, wanted to classify romances as sort of different from realistic novels. We don't make that distinction as much anymore. Our conception of genre has sort of changed, but if we're thinking about romance in that kind of older way, the way people thought about it back in the 19th century, again, sort of handed down to us from chivalric romances, right, where there were often sort of, death-defying escapes and monsters and, hero's journey and all that kind of stuff. So this was around for a long time, and in the 19th century, it continued to be sort of a way to classify fiction that, again, was viewed as maybe a little bit extravagant or fanciful and not always necessarily realistic. So Spofford is often considered, at least a lot of her early work, is often considered to be examples of romance. But she also wrote, well, we see here with Circumstance, she could also write in the Gothic sort of horror vein. That was another genre that she worked within, not just with Circumstance, but a little bit with In the Cellar, which is another, In a Cellar, that was another short story from this collection, which again has a lot of Gothic elements. But again, even some of that Gothic stuff could sometimes be sort of classified under the larger romance heading, like we talked about with Edgar Huntley. how that's sort of a Gothic romance, right? It's got a lot of those features of the older sort of romance style fiction, but also a lot of those specific Gothic features. Except the American Gothic didn't have the castles and the haunted, ancestral families of Europe. Instead, we have the forests, the mountains, and conflict with Native Americans. But we talked about Gothic romance and how not only Brown, but Philip Freneau, remember him back at the beginning of the semester, House of Night, he was kind of working a little bit within that same register. And of course, Poe is often a great example of somebody who's often considered to be writing in sort of a Gothic romantic style. So again, Spofford kind of belongs to that group as well, but she also wrote later in her career, she also wrote something that's kind of a different genre that's sometimes called New England local color. You guys might be familiar with local color. It's kind of related to regionalism. This stuff really developed after the Civil War, later in the 19th century. You guys will probably talk about some of that in Dr. Cooley's class. We don't cover it in this class, but it's part of a big shift that occurs in American literature after the Civil War as we really turn more and more to more realistic prose styles. So we have a lot of sort of regional fiction. And we've already seen some early examples of that with the old Southwestern humor, Washington Irving, right? We've already seen some stuff that's very much based on specific regions and, stories based on regional characteristics. But that would become even more common later in the 19th century. And New England local color was, as you could imagine, stuff set in New England, often focused on kind of rural communities and the unique sort of folkways and cultural practices that existed in those places. So that was a very realistic genre of lit, quite different from what we would think of as sort of the romance or the Gothic romance style of that time. So you guys might be familiar with Mary Wilkins Freeman. I have a book by her here. She wrote in that same sort of genre later in the 19th century. And perhaps one of the more famous examples of New England local color was The Country of Pointed Firs by Sarah Orne Jewett. You guys might know that author's name. Jewett's pretty famous. She's taught pretty often. She comes later. Again, they were more very tail end of 1800s, very early 1900s. So several decades after Spofford. But Spofford's often thought of as kind of a predecessor for the likes of Jewett, who's probably a little more famous, but Spofford was sort of writing that same style of regional fiction set in New England even before that really took off later in the century. But if we're just talking about the Amber Gods, most of the stories here would fall under the romance heading. And they were popular in their time. But in addition to the sort of inventive subject matter that she often exhibited, Spofford, like I said earlier, she's talked about now, at least by some, largely because of her richly descriptive language, her sort of unique style. Kind of a unique style of phrasing. She has that interest in unusual occurrences that we saw, again, with some of those Renaissance figures. So I just wanted to read this little brief passage from Ben Dixon, who wrote a really good critical intro to this edition of The Amber Gods. He also edited the edition. We're going to need to get a little comfortable with this guy because I'm largely ripping off his interpretation of the story. I think it's really smart, and I'm going to present it to you guys in a moment. But in his intro, he says this about Spofford. Like Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville, Spofford expects readers to accept extravagant plots and exotic settings, extraordinary characters, and unusual situations, a prose style that rejects the plain simplicity of ordinary speech in favor of an elaborately wrought literary language, and a process of symbolism in which the natural merges with the supernatural. So he's saying that she, like these Renaissance figures that we've studied, she expected her readers to sort of accept all of that, to be able to in some ways read beneath the surface, because she does have a kind of elaborate prose style. She does have a lot of symbolism. So there's sort of the surface level of this story that we can explore. And it's a pretty straightforward horror story, really, in a lot of ways. And we can just sort of understand the plot and understand what's going on. But then there's a deeper level, like Melville would have said, right? He wants those eagle-eyed readers, those really discerning readers who can go beneath the surface and grab the symbolic meaning, the larger significance that might not always be visible on the surface. So Ben Dixon, throughout the intro, really is making this case that Spofford is very similar to those guys, right? This is part of the process by which Ben Dixon was able to kind of get Spofford in the canon, to kind of get her added to a lot of American literature syllabi. And, again, he's doing this in the 80s, so we can see the kind of reflexive move that he's making by comparing her to Poe and Melville and Hawthorne. He's conferring instant credibility on her. And we might sort of balk at that now, because it's clear that, she needs to be compared to some of these male figures who had already been celebrated in order to get more attention. Maybe now we could go about it a different way, but that's definitely what Ben Dixon is doing. And I was going to read another, if I could find it. Well, this isn't really about those other guys, but this is just a good way to sort of approach the story. And again, to think about it on multiple levels. So he says later in the intro that circumstance balances the graphic depiction of horror, which is kind of the surface level meaning of the story, with a symbolic tale of learning and transcendence. So I want to explore what he means by that, because I think on the surface it's just a scary story about a woman held captive by a panther. So that's just kind of what it is on the surface level. And of course we can appreciate that. And we can appreciate the sort of real visceral fear that a lot of people during the time being depicted here, and this is sort of frontier America, I believe this is set in Maine. So again, we're in New England. That's where most of Spofford's fiction was set. We're in Maine, in a very rural, sort of sparsely settled area. So in places like that, wild animals would have been a real sort of threat on a sort of everyday basis. So on the sort of basic level, our protagonist is walking home from a neighbor's house, her closest neighbor, I guess, who lives quite a long way away. She's over there sort of nursing somebody back to health. And then as she's going back home, she is seized and borne aloft into a nearby tree by a giant panther. So this might put us in mind a little bit of Edgar Huntley. If you guys remember that very sort of vivid scene in the cave when Edgar not only confronts the panther, but also ultimately kills the panther and eats it. And this is a real turning point for Edgar, as we sort of talked about. This is part of his transformation. He's sleepwalking, but he's becoming a different person, right? He kills the panther, then he goes and fights a bunch of Native Americans. He kind of becomes this like action star, and that's a big transformation for the character. So again, just like in that frontier area in Edgar Huntley, in this frontier area that we see in Circumstance, being killed by a large cat or a bear, or maybe being stung, by a poisonous snake, or bitten, I guess, by a poisonous snake. Those would all be, very real fears. So that's what happens, right? And there's a lot of suspense. There's a lot of, sort of thrills and scares as she's able to kind of figure out how to stay alive. So as she's in the grasp of this large cat, she realizes that she can calm it down and perhaps prevent it from eating her by singing. Her singing seems to be soothing to the cat, and she's able to stay alive by singing. And she's able to continue to do that for quite some time until her husband eventually arrives and ostensibly saves her. But again, I can't take credit for this reading. It's really Ben Dixon's reading, but I think it's right. really on the surface, it might seem like her husband is coming to save her from this very fraught, precarious situation. But Ben Dixon makes the case that really he doesn't save her. She actually loses her voice, both literally and figuratively, when he shows up. She has gained a certain amount of power over not only the Panther and her current, difficult situation, but she's also learned things. And like Ben Dixon was saying, she transcends her current reality and really achieves some kind of spiritual state. It's almost like a sort of rapturous state. And it's really quite profound. And then her husband shows up. And then she's relegated back to her sort of traditional role as wife and mother. So Ben Dixon makes the argument, and a lot of other critics have as well, that this is really on a more symbolic level. This is a story about a woman being captured, yes, by the Panther, but also by sort of societal expectations. So not unlike what we talked about when we were reading The Coquette. Very narrow sort of roles prescribed for women during this time in American history. So, they didn't have a lot of freedom. They didn't have a lot of opportunities to sort of make a ton of their own choices or make their own way in the world. They're largely defined by their role within a family unit, as a wife, as a mother, as somebody who can sort of manage the domestic sphere. And like we talked about, that's what a lot of sentimental literature was about. A lot of it sort of had a focus on that domestic sphere and the mothers and the daughters and the aunts and the cousins and all of the people who often existed very much within that, who were often, not exclusively, but often women. So we kind of know that, but we see a return to that role for our protagonist at the end of the story. And for Ben Dixon, that's not really a good thing. That's not really being presented by Spofford as like a victory or some kind of like rescue. It's really a testament to the sort of captive nature of the protagonist's life. So maybe she's not really free at the end. So yeah, we can kind of walk through his reading a little bit more. But again, just kind of keep in mind that in these frontier areas, these kinds of like frontier districts, two of the biggest fears that people would have had, white people, like the characters we see here, they would have been afraid of wild animals and Native American conflict, most likely. So we sort of saw that with Edgar Huntley, and we see it again here. Native Americans don't play a very big direct role in the story, but they do play a role in terms of the plot, what we see at the very end, what has happened to their cabin, their little settlement when they return to it after the husband shows up and shoots the panther. So both of those fears that people would have had in a place like this, rural Maine, in probably the early 19th century, those fears are very much on display here. But also Spofford really wants us to know and makes a point to sort of illustrate early in the story that a lot of weird, scary stuff just sort of happens in frontier districts like this one. It's not just wild animals. There's all kinds of weird things. There's great distances to cover, right? The people who live out there have to be very hardy. They have to be tough. They have to be, sort of made of that kind of tough stuff. And we can kind of sense that our protagonist she is very capable. We know that she's nursing somebody back to health. She's coming back home. She's traveling alone. So she's eminently capable and sort of self-sufficient the way we see her early in the story. But again, we have to sort of work through some of the things that happen. So pretty early on in the text, when she's, beginning her journey back home, she encounters this strange winding sheet that appears before her. It's described as cold, white, and ghastly, held up by hands. Then she hears voices saying, "The Lord have mercy on the people." So, like, what does all that mean? And also, what does it mean that she kind of shakes off the apparition and just continues on her way? Again, Spofford seems to sort of be offering this maybe as evidence that for people like our protagonist, you might see some weird stuff in the woods, right? You might be in a sort of scary situation. That's sort of normal for them. We are sort of meant to understand some specific things about this setting and about what life is like in a place like this. Okay, so yes, we understand that, and then the panther grabs her, right? But again, there's this deeper symbolic level about, again, these social expectations, duties, how women can escape from their social roles. And Ben Dixon even suggests that there could be inscribed within this sort of a message about female artists, and how female artists, especially of the time, were often, their voices were suppressed. They weren't given the same kinds of opportunities to flourish maybe as male artists. And I think we've seen some evidence of that throughout the 19th century on the literary scene, right? Even though many of the women writers were far more popular and successful than the American Renaissance figures, it was the Renaissance figures who were later championed and held up as the best American writing. So we could talk about that a little bit too, but I just want to sort of use the phases that he uses in his interpretation, because he really claims that the whole narrative here in the short story is really just sort of a journey of self-discovery. It's the protagonist's journey towards self-discovery. So the journey is represented by these different stages. Well, the stages of the journey, I should say, are represented by the different kinds of songs that she sings. So let's just go through this. She starts out with lullabies, what's called in the text, cradle songs. The same kinds of songs that she would have hummed or sung to her own children, her own babies. So Ben Dixon makes an astute point here. He says this would have been considered, and maybe still is, lullabies would be considered traditionally feminine. Those would be songs traditionally sung by women to their children, because of course we know in the 19th century women were doing most of the childcare. Women were doing most of the work with babies and young children. And even if it wasn't necessarily a woman singing it to her own child, it might have been a domestic worker doing it for somebody else's child. But that would have been a song, a type of song that would have been coded as feminine, certainly in the 19th century. And we can ask ourselves, would it still be considered that way today? I think, in a lot of parts of the world, yeah, still. So a character like the protagonist would be expected to know and sing a lullaby. So Ben Dixon argues that, okay, she starts out sticking to her role as wife and mother. Okay, so she's thinking, I'm just gonna use a song that I used with my own kids to get them to sleep. Okay, so that's step one on her journey. Okay, but there's a little bit of an unintended side effect to that. As she's singing the lullaby, she starts to think about home. She starts to think about her own family, her own baby, her own husband, her own log cabin. So all these thoughts of domesticity, all these thoughts of her home and her family, they're nice thoughts. Yeah, they're good in a vacuum. But in this particular situation that she finds herself in, they end up distracting her, and she unintentionally stops singing. And this agitates the panther, right? So Ben Dixon makes the argument that for her, in her current predicament, thinking about her family, thinking about her domestic roles as wife and mother, is not only bad, it's dangerous. It's going to get her killed. If she keeps it up, the panther's going to no longer be relaxed, and the panther's going to hurt her, maybe kill her. So again, she stops singing, the panther gets restless, and it seems like he's going to start gnawing on her arm again. So then she starts to sing again, but she's singing something very different now. she's singing what's described in the text as a wild sea song. So this is really interesting, right? Very different genre of music. So now she's starting to sing what Ben Dixon describes as more prototypically masculine songs. Songs that prove to be very successful with the Panther. But these are like sea shanties, reels, jigs, and later what's described as wild, melancholy, forsaken songs, weeping, wailing tunes, and rude, mournful ballads that Shakespeare heard the vagrants sing. So in addition to just being really beautiful prose and really beautiful descriptive language, it's really interesting the types of songs that are being identified here, right? So if we think about sea shanties, right, we're thinking about sailors, we're thinking about people at sea. And that would mostly be men, of course, back in the 19th century. And again, reels and jigs, these were often songs both performed by male musicians and then often perhaps even danced to by men in sort of more masculine homosocial spaces like a ship or like a mining camp, like sort of what I was talking about with Whitman, if you remember that lecture, and like the jolly fellows, the roughs, right? The sort of blue collar workers who often existed in those kind of homosocial spaces like railway camps or mining settlements or logging camps or ships at sea. You know, and Melville had direct experience with that. But talking about sort of those particular spaces, and Whitman was very interested in those spaces, right? And those are the kinds of spaces that our protagonist is kind of tapping into with this sort of second round of songs. And these would not be the types of songs that would necessarily be associated with a woman during that time period. Even the sort of rude, mournful ballads, or those were the ones that Shakespeare heard the vagrants sing. So by mentioning that, we're sort of, what Spofford's doing is she's investing this sort of history, this sort of larger significance into these songs. There's a really long and sort of interesting lineage that these songs are a part of, and our protagonist is now kind of a part of that because she's now singing them. So she's a part of these largely these more masculine, these more historical sort of genres and traditions. So Ben Dixon interprets that as really being when she's really starting to be successful, right? Like this is how she's going to stay alive. And this is when she discovers that she has a certain amount of power and agency that maybe she did not realize before. But then she moves on to the third stage, or the sort of third stage of this journey, and she moves on to a third type of music, which is described as grand and sweet Methodist hymns. So this kind of transports her to a different state of mind. And this is where that sort of revelry happens. So she kind of goes into this sort of religious experience. It almost seems like she's having a vision. I believe it's described in the text as a divine rapture. So this is a very different type of thing. And again, it's described in these very religious terms, and she seems to be gaining strength and a certain resolve from this religious experience or vision that she's having. And it's when she's in the midst of this rapturous experience, it's very important to note, she's in the midst of that when her husband shows up. When her husband shows up, I think with the baby, right? And with his gun, he's there to rescue her, right? He's there to fulfill his sort of traditional role as the man, as the protector. And now she's about to be returned to her traditional role. But Ben Dixon points out that when the husband shows up, a few important things happen. So first, the fervent vision of God's peace that she had been contemplating goes away, Okay, so he kind of wrecks her spiritual or religious experience by showing up. So that's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is that she literally loses her voice. Probably because she's been singing for a long time in a tree while being held onto by a large, dangerous cat. So she's probably a bit fatigued. And she loses her voice. But again, Ben Dixon is reading that as both a literal event of the plot and also a very symbolic thing, right? Her husband showing up takes away her voice, takes away her agency. All the things that she's discovered about herself, this really profound religious experience that she was having, that's all gone now, right? Now she's a sort of a damsel in distress. Now she's going to be restored to her role as wife and mother. So again, Ben Dixon really reads the husband's rescue in a very negative way, and he reads the overall effect that her family has on her in a pretty negative way. She was kind of doing okay without them. Yes, eventually, if she couldn't keep singing all night, we could presume that the panther would probably eventually devour her. But because of her religious sort of awakening or whatever that is, that revelry, that rapturous experience that she's having, she almost seems to be at peace with whatever's going to happen. This great sense of peace has come over her, and it almost seems to transcend her literal physical circumstances. And that's certainly what Ben Dixon argues. But again, then her child and husband appear, right? It's the husband carrying the child. So the entire family unit is there, and immediately she loses that power that she had gained. So Ben Dixon finds a lot of significance in the phrase we see in the story that goes, "She had learned the secret of sound at last." So again, on the literal level, it seems like maybe our narrator, Spofford, the writer, if we want to think of it that way, is really just talking about the songs that the protagonist is singing and the power that her own voice, the power that her ability to sing does have on the panther and, over this situation. But again, Ben Dixon is saying it's more than that. It's about learning. It's about transcendence. Yes, she learns about the music and what she can do with the music, but she also learns that she has power that's sort of beyond just herself, and it's beyond her family, right? Because that's what he points out. The power that she discovers, the power that she's able to harness to stay alive, it has nothing to do with her husband, and it really doesn't have that much to do with her kid. I mean, the lullabies are how she starts, but she finds her best success with the more masculine music, and then she has the religious experience, and all of that seems very personal. All of that seems very individual, very unique to her. It's not really about her family. It's not really about anything else. It's about her own power and her ability to transcend. But in the presence of her husband, she loses her vision of God. She loses her voice. She stops singing. And again, it seems like that's a big loss, and Ben Dixon certainly reads it that way. But she does seem changed, maybe, to a certain extent, even though she has been restored to that typical traditional role as wife and mother. But then there's that twist at the end. When they get back, their home, their little, surrounding village has been destroyed, attacked by Native Americans while they were gone. And a lot of it was burned to the ground. So then we get this weird final allusion, this time to Paradise Lost and Adam and Eve. What do we make of the ending? And what do we make of the new situation that our protagonist finds herself in? Just one more thing from Ben Dixon, another sort of part of his interpretation. He compares what we see here in Circumstance, again, to what we would see a little bit later in the 19th century from some other women authors. He specifically mentions Kate Chopin and the author of The Awakening, who wrote in the late 1800s, but he's saying that Spofford is doing something very similar to what Chopin would later do, which is sort of depict the agonies, the struggles undergone by female artists, and often doing this in a symbolic way, but showing how female artists were often barred, from the marketplace, barred from free expression, and they could often, these writers would often represent that through their plots and through the things that are happening to those protagonists in their text. So we might see a little bit of that in Circumstance as well. So again, we can appreciate it as a horror story, a very effective, spooky story about a big panther threatening the life of our protagonist. But Ben Dixon, I think, shows us a lot of the symbolic value and a way to see the story operating on deeper levels. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Just before we sign off, I want to see if I can find this. I don't think I actually have it in my notes anymore. I think it's in the module. So I'll just spare you guys for now. I would just say read it in the module. There's an interesting connection between Spofford and Emily Dickinson, who were contemporaries. Now, we're not reading Dickinson. You will read her in Dr. Cooley's class. We don't really have time. We just simply do not have time to cover her in this class. But I want you to read a little bit about it in the module because there is an interesting connection between these two authors. They definitely read each other's work. We don't think they were really personally acquainted, but Dickinson writes specifically about Spofford and about Circumstance. So not only were they sort of linked by a little bit of editorial and sort of publication history, which I'm less interested in, I also think it's noteworthy to say that Dickinson herself thought that Circumstance was a scary story, and she appreciated it. So that's kind of fun. You'll get to Dickinson in the next part of 451. But again, Spofford is a part of a much sort of larger literary tradition, not just with her work here, but like I said, with that later New England local color, the way she kind of anticipates later writers like Kate Chopin, and even her connection to Dickinson, who we tend to remember to this day, sort of keeps her relevant, keeps Spofford as an interesting, important figure for us. So I have that little story about the two of them in the module. So just read that. Let me know if you have any questions about really any of the texts. If you need to clarify anything that's on the final exam study guide. Like I said, if you have any questions about the final assignments or anything that we've read, just let me know. I wish you guys luck. I've really enjoyed the class. I hope you guys have too. I hope you found at least a handful of texts that you've really enjoyed. Hope we've learned a few things about the first half of American literature. At least up until the Civil War. I'm not sure if we can really divide it into equal halves, but feel free to reach out. I really am here to help throughout the rest of the semester. So this week and next week, I'll be checking my email every day. I always do, but I know this is an especially busy time. So don't hesitate. I'm not too busy to help. If you have questions, if you want a video conference, just let me know. And I look forward to reading your work. Have a great Christmas break, and good luck with everything.